Hi, it's Jared with PyXQL again. Today we're going to be going through strings and variables. To start off, we're going to get back into Thony. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And we're back down into the shell again, just to try and talk a little bit about strings. So the first off is creating a string. Now we have a double quote sign where we can do, let's say, my string. Let me get rid of that. Okay. And that turns back to my string. Now notice when it comes back, it has single quotes around it. That's because in Python, the single quote is usually the standard to establishing a string, where like in Excel, it's double quotes. So usually inside Python, you're actually going to use a single quote and go my string. And most of your returns, anything that's a string, is usually always going to come back in that single quote. Now, here's the exception. The double quote and the single quotes are interchangeable. But the thing is, if you use a double quote, then a single quote, it's not going to show up as a quote mark per se. So let's just say double quote, I'm hungry. Okay. Now it's going to come back, and it's going to come back with double quotes because that single quote is part of the string itself. Now, if I was to just flip that around, now this isn't quite correct, but if I say I'm hungry again, and I use single quotes on the outside, then that double quote is considered as part of the string that's being used there. See, it comes back, single string, I'm hungry. Now, one way to get around that is by using 3 pairs of double quotes. 1, 2, 3, then I'm really hungry, said Joe. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3 at the end. And oh, I'm gonna go to syntax error. It's probably because Joe Baskin. There we go. And you can see that it has single quotes on the outside, and then it uses this escape character, and that escape character is the backward slash. So typically, if you need something like that, where it's like I'm, and you need quote marks somewhere like that, a backslash is usually the standard for that. Now, whether you use a single quote or double quote doesn't necessarily matter, but like I said, it's best syntax to use single quote when possible. And if you're not using single quotes, using the triple quote marks like this, that's usually the best practice. Okay. Now, so far in this, all we're doing is we've been just typing in, let's say I'm hungry, and then hitting enter, and that returns this. Usually what you need to do, though, is you actually need to use the print function if you want to see something like that. So if I say print, and then I go Bob's, let's get Bobby just for the sake of it. Okay. Then it's going to come back and it's going to actually print Bobby. Now notice what it's doing is back here, we're returning a text. We're returning a string, I'm sorry. And down here, it's actually printing the word. You can tell a difference because there's no quote marks around this. And so typically, if you want something to print out inside the shell, you want to use the print function instead of just trying to hit the enter button. Now comes the question of how do we get strings together? Okay, so we can do print Bobby, and I'm going to use 2 B's on there. Bobby is hungry, and then I'm going to say, let's say you can use a plus sign now. Okay, it's not very good without variables, so next thing to do is talk about variables. Oh, yeah, I did it again. I used a capital P instead of a lowercase p. There we go. Notice that I didn't use any spaces between that. So now it says Bobby hungry and no space now. So if I want to make sure I do this correctly, I'm going to use a space in between. Okay. Now let's talk about variables. Now variables are things that you assign a value to. And variables can be used all over the place. And pretty much everything you see, you're going to see a variable in it. So if I'm going to say the variable is name, and I'm going to say equals Bobby. Okay. Now, if I go name and I return it, it's going to return back the string Bobby. If I say type, remember that function that we used last time? Name, it's going to give me back that it's a class, it's a string class. So usually when you're combining text, let's say if we're doing print somebody is hungry, what I would want to do usually is have that space there and say name plus space is hungry now. And I usually don't use a plus sign in here. That's usually bad practice. So now printing the name is hungry now. Now that you can tell this is a little bit different than Excel, where Excel you'd use the and symbol, and Excel you'd use a double quotes, where in Python you're using single quotes and you're using the plus sign to combine these. Now let's say you want to print on 2 different lines. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit up, and I'm going to say, I'm going to go right here inside my string. I'm going to use a backward slash and the letter N. Okay. Now, in most IDEs, if you use the backward slash and the N, it'll show up as a different color. Here in Thony, for whatever reason, it's just not. But if you go ahead and enter, you'll notice that it does create 2 lines. And notice that the second line does have a space there because I didn't remove the space here. Usually you'd want to have it, basically be all in the same area. So we can go ahead and do that. Okay, now a little bit more with variables. In a lot of programming languages, you have to tell the program what type of data type the variable is before you can call the variable. In Python, that's not the case. So your variables can change mid-program. So right now, the type for name is string. Okay. But if I want to say name equals 1, and then do that again, I'm going to get an int. Now, if I want to say name is true, and I ask again what type is, it's going to give me a Boolean. And so those can change anytime in the program. So you got to be careful on what type your variables are as you're trying to work through your program. You'll notice that because it's so flexible, you can really get hung up in a lot of spaces. Where in other programming languages, if you say what the type is before, sometimes that can help you with errors because it'll show up and say, hey, this variable we thought was going to be an int, turns out it's a float, which are very similar, but obviously a little different. Now inside Python, that's a lot of the great things about the flexibility is that we can change things as we go. Now to assign a variable, we've already seen it. You have the name of the variable on the left-hand side. And in most cases with Python, you have, let's say, Bo's or Bo name, okay? Most of the time when you're calling a variable, it's all lowercase, and you have an underscore in between the different words. Okay, there are times when you use capitals, but usually it's when you're doing a class. So this is usually best practice to call variables inside of Python. Equals, and we're going to say Bo. Okay, and then if I want to print Bo name, okay, so a couple things to pay attention to is that you want to use the print function to figure out what variables are at times, kind of like print Bo name. And the other thing is you want to use the type function to figure out what things are at times as well. Now, one thing that you can use as we go into the program is using the print and the type together. So just kind of like in Excel, how you can nest functions. In Python, you can do the same thing. So I'm going to say I want to print. And what do I want to print? I want to print the type of the variable, which is Bo name, which is a class string. And so notice that here it's returning it just because we're using the shell. But inside of a regular Python program, that won't be the case. But when you use the print function, it'll print out to the shell so that you know what you're doing. It's kind of a good way to troubleshoot a little bit. Another useful function with strings is the len function. This is a function you'll be familiar with if you used Excel a lot. So we're going to say len boname, and notice it gives us back 5, and that's because it's BO space BO, so that's 5 letters. Now another question is, okay, well, how do I get numbers inside of our strings? Okay, so let's say we want to type, or we want to print boname. I'm just going to remove some of this to do it. And then you say plus 5. Well, right here, it's just going to say, hey, you can't concatenate a string with an integer. Okay, so there's one more function that we need to worry about, and that's how to cast a variable into the function, into the type that you want. Okay, so we're going to start about string here. That's str. When you use str as a function and you put something inside of that, it will force that to become a string. Okay, so in this case, bobo5. Okay, now if we wanted to put a space in there, I'd say the plus sign, single space, and then a plus sign again, so that it's bobo space 5. Okay, now let's go backwards a little bit and talk about integers. If you had a string that was 5, it comes back at 5, and we say type, and it's going to be a string. If we want to make that an integer, what we use is we use the int function, int. Okay, and that would come back as the integer. Now, if we want to change that to a float, we use the float function. Okay, that changes to a float. So in all these, let's say I want to print a float of 5. It's going to print the value of 5.0. Okay, so in this lesson, we talked about strings, we talked about variables, and then we talked about how to cast different data types as other data types, meaning int, float, and int, float, and string, sorry. Then we also talked about how to concatenate strings. Concatenate means combine together. In Excel, there's the concat function, and now there's actually concatenate. And so that's what you kind of use here. Now, there's other ways to do it, but I find that this is one of the better ways to do it. There's also one other way that I probably want to show you really quick, and that's using a variable inside of your string. So let's say I print something where I say someone is hungry. His name is, I'm going to use the squiggly marks. Okay. Now, this is where I can insert a variable that I might not know what it is. Instead of using the plus signs and kind of concatenate a bunch of things, sometimes it's better to just use something like this. Now, to do this, you have to put the letter F in the beginning of your string. Okay. And then when you have the squiggly mark, it's saying that you're going to use a variable in that. And I'm going to say the variable boname. Okay. Squiggly mark again. So someone is hungry. It helps if I say, instead of his name. His name is boname, which is the variable. And then I'm going to use a period and end it with a quote mark again. Okay. And let's go ahead and actually end that function with parentheses. Then I'm going to have someone is hungry. His name is Bobo, period. Now, there are other ways to insert variables. I find this to be the simplest way. And it's the one that I use the most. And if you were trying to learn everything you can about Python, then I would encourage you to find the other different ways. But right now, it's good enough to just say add the F in the front and move on. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about lists, and that might be more than one lesson, but it's really important to get a good grasp of lists. And probably before we do that, we're also going to talk about organizing your pages so that we can actually start saving some of this code. When we're using the shell, it's interesting and you kind of play with it, but we're not actually saving anything. So we're going to talk a little about files and how to do some organization. Okay, see you there.